Recording.
First one is 6 minutes.
Tell me when you're ready.
Genetically modified organisms have come to the forefront of the public eye. Many feel that they have been understudied and underregulated. This has led many to wonder what food is and isn't genetically modified. Such fears have led the entire West Coast to mandate the labeling of genetically modified organisms. There just simply isn't enough research to justify GMO's expansive use and its role in almost everything we eat. There are environmental and health risks that need to be acknowledged, and those risks range from super pests to infertility. So first, harms and significances. First harm, genetically modified crops pose biodiversity and mutation risks to the environment. According to the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research from 2012, in Britain, farm-scale evaluations were conducted from 2000 to 2003 to assess the impacts on biodiversity of cultivating herbicide-tolerant GM varieties. Fields of GM sugar beet and GM oilseed rape were found to have fewer weeds and weed seeds than fields growing conventional sugar beet and oilseed rape varieties. This led to a lower food supply for insects that feed on these plants. This in turn had effects on the next predators in the food chain. Fewer butterflies and bees were observed than comparable conventional fields. Also, according to the Journal of Environmental Science Europe from 2012, the engineering of crops immune to the same chemical compound that poisons weeds and crops capable of producing their own insecticides has resulted in an additional 404 million pounds of toxic pesticides doused on U.S. fields between 1996, when genetically modified organisms were first introduced as farm crops, and 2011. According to Line Peoples of the Huffington Post, before biotechs came onto the market, we had, actually Scott McAllister, a third-generation Iowa farmer, said that before biotech came to the market, we had one airplane in the county to do all the aerial spraying. Now they bring 7 or 8. We've got the same acreage of crops, they're just spraying more. Several weed varieties, such as pigweed, have developed resistance to Roundup and are quickly evolving into superweeds across the nation's heartland. These superweeds grow bigger, stronger, and more prolifically than their original form because of their mass and strength. These superweeds break farm equipment and ruin entire crops. That's according to Jack Weber. So clearly, superweeds are an issue, and they actually are created. A lot of times people will argue that superweeds aren't actually a factor because they're very unlikely to happen. However, we have seen them happen. And on top of superweeds, we also have super pests, super bugs. Also according to Jack Weber, in addition to superweeds, superbugs have also developed. Where superweeds develop resistance to Roundup, superbugs have developed resistance to Bt toxin. One such superbug is the corn rootworm, a pest to corn plants, for which Bt toxin technology was originally developed to mitigate. Another is the pink bollworm affecting genetically engineered crops in India. But the point is that Bt toxin technology was developed to get rid of the corn rootworm. And the corn rootworm actually was able to evolve and mutate and now has resistance built. There was also a study done going on more about the environmental harms. There was a study done by Berkeley in 2010 that showed that pesticides can turn male frogs into female frogs. And like I said earlier, with the increase in genetically modified crops that have resistance to pesticides and herbicides, we're putting even more pesticides and herbicides on our crops because they have that resistance. So, in doing so, we're just exacerbating this issue, like those shown in the Berkeley 2010 study, where male frogs were turned into female frogs, as well as a study done by the University of Koblenz-Landau in Germany that found that widely used pesticides can kill frogs within an hour. Second harm is genetically modified crops are also a risk to human health. Roundup-ready GMOs are resistant to herbicides, so now farmers in the industry are using a lot more herbicide because it no longer affects the crops. According to Andrew Kimbrell, head of the Center for Food Safety in Washington, GMO foods offer no benefits, no more nutrition, no more flavor, no nothing. They only offer risks. These risks include health risks to consumers, especially children, to our soil, to our water, to our farm workers, to our wildlife, and to the whole planet. Charles Benbrook from the Journal of Environmental Science states this when he's talking about how we add an additional 404 million pounds of these toxic pesticides. And knowing that, a study done by epidemiologist Shauna Swan found that men from rural Missouri had lower sperm counts than men from New York City, Los Angeles, and even here in Minneapolis. This is linked to the chemicals and pesticide use. And like I said, herbicides will only make the issue worse. So my plan is to pass legislation that will require labeling of GM foods. The FDA will continue to be in charge of the labeling process, as they always have been, and this will occur through normal means. This will work because 54% of people believe that GM foods are unsafe, and an additional 13% are unsure about them. 93% say the federal government should require labels on foods saying whether it's been genetically modified or bioengineered, and 57% say they'd be less likely to buy foods labeled as genetically modified. And this just shows, and that final fact shows that labeling genetically modified foods will in fact lower the production of genetically modified crops.
Do you want to use your
Question.
Oh, right.
Oh, yeah.
Is that 2 minutes?
Yes, it's 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Okay, so your plan, just to be clear right now, to pass legislation labeling GM foods, and the FDA will be in charge through normal means.
Yes, it'll occur through normal means. The FDA has always been in charge of labeling foods, so we're just going to continue to allow them to be in charge.
What is your link here that labeling will actually make, are you saying that labeling GM foods will eventually help preserve the environment and also delete all of the risks that you were talking about?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. I didn't get to it in my speech. This plan will solve the current issues because consumers are likely to avoid genetically modified foods, thus pressuring the market to produce fewer genetically modified crops. Because of this, there will be far fewer health and environmental risks associated with farming. And my statement saying that they're likely to avoid genetically modified foods is proven by my statistics given by the ABC News poll.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier that the pigweed, and they're becoming super weeds, and they're getting bigger, they're getting stronger, and they actually eventually break farms' equipment and ruin the entire crops. How many cases of that has actually happened?
I don't have a specific number on how many cases that it has happened. However, the fact that it has happened in at least one case, it's safe to assume that it's happened in more, given that these genetically modified organisms are mass-produced and all very similar.
Okay. What were some of the human health risks other than the lower sperm count that you mentioned? Or was that the only one?
That was the biggest one.
Okay.
But Dr. Andrew Kimbrell specifies that children are especially susceptible to these health risks.
By that, what do you mean? Like, how are they susceptible to
I don't know exactly how. I just know.
Okay.
Dr. Kimbrell from the head of the Center for Food Safety in Washington,
Okay.
which I believe is a very credible source.
Okay. Can I see that source when you said that consumers are likely to avoid because of your plan? Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's right there. So like I said, 54% of people, according to this poll done by ABC News just last year in 2013,
Okay.
54% of people believe that genetically modified foods are unsafe, and an additional 13% are unsure about them. And on top of that, 93% of people actually believe that the federal government should require labels on foods saying whether or not it's been genetically modified or bioengineered. And on top of that, just to kind of really back up my solvency, 57% of people said they'd be less likely to buy foods labeled as genetically modified.
use my time. Could you set it to 2 minutes so I don't use the whole thing, please?
Yes, 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. That would be half of my time, right?
Yes.
All right, awesome, thanks. Huh?
It's been 30 seconds.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, you can let me know when it's 1 minute too. This sucks.
It's been a minute. Seconds until it's 2 minutes. That's 2 minutes.
Okay. All right.
You're gonna 7 minutes, right?
Huh?
7 minutes.
7 minutes. Right?
Yeah, she's 7.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so I'd like to go start with on case first. I'm not really sure if I actually have an on case, but let's go with on case. So the affirmative has brought up that right now the status quo is that GMO is underregulated. There's not enough research that has been done. We're not labeling enough of them, and because of that, there is the environmental and health risks that are happening. With the environmental health risk, he brought up that there's a risk to our biodiversity. He brought up that the pigweeds are turning into superweeds and they're destroying the farm equipment and destroying entire crops. He's also saying that by putting the toxin in its genome itself and making GM crops, we're making herbicides tolerant even more. We're making a lot of mutations by this. He's also saying that superbugs are created because of this. There's just a lot of Roundup resistance. He's also saying that because of GM crops, male frogs are turning into female frogs, mutating into those. And also he's saying that some human health risks that has happened was that there's a lower sperm count, in men that they were finding. So his plan was saying that he wants to pass a legislation to label GM foods, and FDA will be in charge, and just through normal means. And he's linking that labeling will lower the productivity because the consumers would likely not want to buy GM food instead. I agree with his status quo. The fact that right now the precautionary principle is not being applied to the degree that is needed. So I agree with him that right now there is not enough research that is done currently to do anything. But I don't have a counter plan, so there's no off case, but I'm going to say that his plan doesn't work. And here's why. Labeling GMO basically shouldn't be on the top of the to-do list. So as of today, 17 states has initiated to pass labeling GMO into law. Out of those states, 17 states, Connecticut, Georgia, Hawaii, Illinois, Iowa, Louisiana, Maine, Massachusetts, Missouri, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Oklahoma, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and all of the other stuff, have successfully passed it and have signed into law. If labeling GMO is going to solve the harms that were proposed, then it wouldn't have only be the 17 states proposing it, but it would also be all 50, and they would get passed sooner than that. Two, labeling GMO is not unique. As stated in the previous article or whatever read above, it's been initiated. It has not been mandatory at the national level for obvious reasons, because it doesn't work. Another reason, so my harms of his plan 1 would be the labeling would not discourage products, and harms 2 would be that GMOs are not harmful. So the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the American Medical Association, the World Health Organization, all find genetically modified food ingredients safe with no negative health effects associated with their use. I'm not sure how he linked the sperm count or the frog to that of GM foods, but all the big name organization earlier has declared that GM foods are safe. Labeling GMOs is not effective. The EU officially recognized that approved GM foods are as safe as conventional foods, that labeling is only necessary to provide information for consumer choice. Once labeling regulations are implemented, it is actually food processors and retailers who are affected. Another point, GMO labeling will increase grocery prices. The fact that labeling mandates would cost consumer money is not new. The food prices will absolutely rise to the tune of hundreds of dollars for the average family. Because most Americans eat GMOs every day. Americans have been consuming GMOs for 17 years with no ill effects as far as we know. There are actually, and that is from the Journal of Integrative Plant Biology, that are widely known and may be consumed as food. Soybean, maize, corn, canola, and sugar beets, they all contain GMOs, and we all consume that thing daily. Another thing, I guess my harms is that his regulation, because the absence of risks that we both agreed on, that there's not enough research, it prevents effective regulation, because we don't know what's actually happening to the claim of the environmental health risk and all of that. Those are all risks, because we don't really know what's actually going bad. We can't really do effective regulations. But really, mandatory GM food labeling, it will just raise food prices. And that has a couple of sources. Tom Philfoot, staff writer for Mother of Jones. As labeling becomes mandatory, producers will switch to more expensive non-GMO sources for their products. Food for manufacturers to get non-GMO versions of these substances that have to pay a premium in a marketplace, hence higher ingredient costs that they want to pass on to consumers. With mandatory GMO labeling, increased production costs will be passed to consumers. That's from William Lesser, Professor Dyson School of Applied Economics, Cornell University. He studied the impact of voluntary GMO labeling versus mandatory GMO labeling. Voluntary labeling is an option, in which case the costs are borne by the sellers and largely passed on to consumers seeking those products. But making it mandatory would be the obligation to all of the consumers instead. So with that, I would like to say that his link to label GMO will not be effective enough to make consumers avoid buying GMO products, because one, it's not able to be done because there's no food in the United States that has no GM ingredients, and it's not unique, and putting the labels on will actually just increase the cost of food prices to the consumers in itself.
Question?
Yeah.
Wait.
Okay.
So quick question. You said that labeling genetically modified foods would not deter purchases.
Mm-hmm.
What your reasoning, what's your source? Because I have polling data that says that 57% of people said they'd be less likely to buy foods labeled as genetically modified organisms.
Well, okay, they might say that if they just say, oh, this is GMO and this is not GMO, which one would you choose? But there's no basis on that choice because they don't know that by making it mandatory labeling that it will fall on them. It will fall on the consumers.
And what source do you have that says, could you repeat your source that said how much it'll cost the consumers?
I don't have a specific number of how much it will cost consumers, but
Okay, because I have a specific number that from the Eco Northwest,
Okay.
Which is a economic consulting firm in the Pacific Northwest.
Mm-hmm.
So a firm that's not associated with the environment, it's strictly economic.
Okay.
Who says that labeling GM foods would cost each consumer $2.30 per year. So cutting back 2 McDoubles from McDonald's a year would make up for those costs of labeling genetically modified foods, according to Eco Northwest.
Well,
And
this
eco
is-
standing for economic, not
Okay, well, this is
ecological.
also another economics guy. He doesn't have the specific number, but that's his.
And he says that it will raise costs, like just based off of your summation of what he said. He says it's going to raise costs, and I'm not arguing with you that it is going to raise costs. What I am arguing is that it's going to be insignificant. Like I said, taking 2 McDoubles off of your yearly consumption will make up for those costs. Another question I have for you is, you said